Everybody, thanks for coming. It's great to be here. Well, actually, I'm here every day. It's nice to have an audience with an engaged perspective on things, and I'm glad the technology is working for us all to get together and talk and engage. As Bill and I were talking before we started, as you might have heard, classes up at SU are hybrid and live. So I meet with a handful of students live and in person, and the other half virtually. But it's always nice to have a big audience wherever I go. With our talk today, I kept the title relatively vague. I kept it vague because I never know what's going to be going on every day. Every day these days seems like a new crazy environment. So I kept it vague as free speech, contemporary free speech, because every day there's a different free speech issue that's coming up that we're confronted with. So I almost didn't want to lock myself into something that might change in the next day anyway. I was born in the early 1970s, so I don't know what it was like in the 60s with the protests and the chaos and the intersection of multiple issues. I always thought it was kind of a chaotic time from what I read and what I learned from talking to people, and no matter what kind of chaos we went through in the 1960s, it seems, at least from my perspective, to be more chaotic and maybe more complicated today. So maybe some of you can educate me later on when we open this up for a conversation. But we turn on TV, we pick up whatever media we refer to, and it doesn't take long for us to really find a contemporary free speech or even First Amendment issue to talk about. So I do have PowerPoints I'm going to refer to because that will help illustrate a few of these issues. But we're going to talk a little about protests. Every day there seems to be a new protest. And from my perspective, the media is doing a phenomenal job of bringing the issues to a wider audience, to the public, and really serving as an important check on authority and power, and telling some pretty disturbing stories. So we'll talk a little about protests. We'll talk a little about some executive authority and abuse of some executive authority in a few areas. And if we have time, we'll get into the Supreme Court and maybe close it all out with a little talk on voting issues. So let me see if I can share the screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see this okay. So
yep.
With protests, these protests, we have protests here in Syracuse. We've seen some pretty important protests in Rochester and Buffalo, but Portland seems to be dominating the news these days. And I'd like to talk a little about a connection we have to the Portland protests. I'm a former student, a professional photographer, a professional news photographer from the Newhouse School. She graduated last year with a master's degree in photography, and her name is Marine Staub. She moved to Portland to cover the protests, and shortly after, sometime over the summer when she was shooting the protest, she was arrested by police and also caught a non-lethal beanbag, a crowd disbursement tool, caught one of those in her knee and had to go to the hospital for that. So Marine's been in touch with me, especially after she got arrested, because she needed some help finding lawyers. But she also has sent me a number of her photographs, and I'd like to share the photographs with you and then maybe talk a little about that, because they're I find them to be very dramatic. This is a night shot with police and federal agents. More police. This was a protester who was in the line of some tear gas and pepper spray.
Excuse me, but the audio is very weak.
Okay, I'll try to speak up, but my mic is really not that strong. So this photo is a protester who was in the line of tear gas and pepper spray. This is a medical professional who goes to the protests every night to provide medical attention to protesters who are hurt. These are a couple of police officers who seem to be enjoying their job. And this is Marine's website and her arrest report when she was arrested for covering and shooting the protests. She's got videos and pictures, and dozens and hundreds of pictures on the website. I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. So, when we talk about free speech issues and the confluence of issues, obviously the right to assemble is critical under our First Amendment, as is the right to petition government and complain to and about government policy. And we've seen these protests all over the country following the high-profile and dramatic release of the video involving George Floyd in Minnesota. And on one hand, protesting is nothing new, but on the other hand, in a modern, contemporary setting, these protests are continuing, and they're driven by a number of public policy issues and fueled by the independent press. It's a laboratory in many respects for these First Amendment issues, because we'd have no idea what was going on if reporters and photographers like my former student and others weren't out there telling us these stories. And again, you can agree with the protesters, you can disagree with the protesters, or you can fall somewhere in the middle. But these protests are really, in some ways, different from protests that we've seen before, because you have you've got multiple sides coming together and turning these protests into fights and riots. And some of this really traces its origins back to a couple of years ago in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we saw what happened there. And obviously, much of the rhetoric is not being ameliorated or mitigated by leadership. Right? We don't have we don't have a president coming in and saying and trying to bring people together. There's this divisiveness that seems to exacerbate things. So it really does put us into an interesting and perhaps an awkward position, because we do have that right to assemble peaceably, but what happens when it devolves, when it turns into a riot? And that's what we've been seeing a lot of all over the place, all over the country. So I do credit our journalists for taking substantial risks to tell us these stories. Um, we've seen reporters obviously get caught in the crossfire. We've seen reporters there was a reporter that caught a beanbag, and again, these are euphemisms. These are not beanbags. These are pretty harmful, heavy weapons that, if used in the wrong way, could cause serious damage. Now, there was a reporter, I think this was also in Minnesota, who caught one right in the eye and lost sight in her eye. And on top of that, we've seen reporters all over the country get arrested. In July, I was watching CNN live at like 6:30 in the morning when a reporter was arrested live on the air for just doing his job. I mean, he really wasn't getting in the way. He wasn't interfering with anything. He was just doing a live stand-up, a narrative of what was going to happen that morning, and he was arrested. Obviously, he was released later that morning, but how much reporting is somebody going to be able to do when they're dragged into a jail cell? So, we've got all these First Amendment rights, but when you're on the street and law enforcement is arresting you or trying to shut you down, you can waive the Constitution all you want. You're still going to go to jail, and it's a troubling environment. For a long time, reporters were largely left alone to do their job at protests. Obviously, there were isolated incidents. Every now and then, a reporter would get arrested, but it seems like reporters are almost being targeted in some of these settings, and that's not something that we're used to here. And then we can take it local. In July, one of our own news photographers at Syracuse.com and the Post Standard we saw was thrown to the ground by riot police, and all he was doing was standing there with his camera. So, I can't put myself in the shoes of law enforcement in one of these heated situations. I would assume that there's some chaos involved in that, and a lot of emotion and a lot of tension. But taking shots at reporters and photographers is really a deviation from previous standards. I had covered a couple of protests, major protests when I was a reporter, and I never felt that law enforcement was going to take it out on me. But things have changed, and it's a different world today, and we see that live on the news, and it's not something that I've seen in my lifetime to this extent. But I'm glad we still have reporters who are there to tell us the story. So let me switch my screen again. Again, if you're interested, that's her website. You can see more of her work and photography there, and it is kind of stunning. And if you can watch some of the video, that's pretty scary too. And just to close out with Marinee, my former student, this is a professional photographer who's been all over the world. She's done photography in Jordan and Central Africa and and Iraq. And where does she have to buy a combat helmet and bulletproof vest? But right here in the United States. So, things certainly have changed, and we don't have to go all over the country to see these changes either. So that that's that. We'll reserve questions for later on as well. So, another thing that we're really not used to is injunctions against the media and attempts to block publications. And I think we could rename this summer the Summer of Injunctions, because we had 2 formal injunctions and 1 attempted blocking of an author. So let me take a couple steps back. I know some of you probably do have, we probably do have a few former lawyers or in the room here today, but an injunction or a temporary restraining order is, a legal effort to block some behavior. And this transcends legal issues. We see you can have an injunction or a restraining order in just about any type of legal dispute. Most commonly, these come up in issues of domestic violence or issues involving dangerous conditions that one party wants to block, like a factory spilling toxic waste into a river or smoke into the environment, right? You would file an injunction to block that or to change that. In media settings, injunctions are somewhat unusual, largely because of the First Amendment. To further illustrate this, we can go back to 1971 and the Pentagon Papers. That was, again, the New York Times's expose based on documents that were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, exposing all the lies perpetrated by the government leading up to the Vietnam War, and it was based on these classified top secret documents that were based on raw data and dispatches and military information. So the New York Times got a copy of this leaked by Ellsberg, and then the government, the Nixon administration, filed an injunction or a temporary restraining order in federal court in New York City, as well as federal court in Washington, to block both the New York Times and the Washington Post. And this went at breakneck speed all the way to the US Supreme Court. 17 days from publication to a decision by the Supreme Court, with the Supreme Court coming back and saying that injunctions require a really heavy burden of proof by the government because of the First Amendment. So the Pentagon Papers case, which is titled US versus New York Times, really stands for something strong with our First Amendment and our democracy, that the government can't go to court to block publication. Okay, so again, in the grand scheme of global governance, it's kind of it was an unusual set of facts, but a strong statement about the value and the purpose of the First Amendment. And for history buffs, for more than a century, the predominant theory under the First Amendment was that censorship or prior restraint was bad, for lack of a better description, or at the very least unconstitutional unless it met a substantial government interest. So that's our backdrop, right? A compelling government interest, right? And again, that's an interest of the highest order. And usually that manifests itself in specific information about, say, troop movements, like where the troops are going, or the sailing dates of military or naval ships, right? Really, really specific and potentially harmful information. Then we fast forward to the Pentagon Papers, and the government said, well, not quite, right? This set of facts does not meet a compelling government interest. So that's our backdrop. And then we have the summer of 2020, where we've got two books about to hit the market, one by John Bolton and the other by Mary Trump, the president's niece, which the president went to court to try to block. And shortly after both of these, Michael Cohen, the former fixer, handler, found himself with more restrictions regarding his home confinement. And that interestingly came around right about when he was about to publish his book. So we'll talk about all three of these. Okay. So these are the book covers and the Mary Trump book. It was an interesting set of facts on that one because the administration and one of President Trump's brothers tried to block the publication by invoking this confidentiality agreement or this non-disclosure agreement that the party signed, which in turn had an effect on these First Amendment rights, right? So again, there's no question that a book would be protected under the First Amendment, but we do have a question of whether an injunction here would satisfy the standard or the compelling interest here to justify the prior restraint of the censorship. The judge in the Mary Trump case, state court judge down in, I believe it was Westchester, wrote that it bears noting that while parties are free to enter into confidentiality agreements, courts are not necessarily obligated to specifically enforce them, whether to issue an injunction is a matter of equity. So again, the judge has the leeway to decide in those settings. And then this next paragraph, Justice Shankman really talks about what's going on here, that the legitimate interest in preserving the family secret is one thing, but it's another thing when it's the family of the president. So again, a state court judge here in New York making a bold statement about the constitutionality of the president censoring a book. All right. In the Bolton case, again, the administration was alleging that John Bolton was going to violate national security. And again, keep in mind that case is still open. The government is actively investigating whether John Bolton did violate national security standards. So he still might end up facing some legal liability there. But again, the subsequent punishment is a little different than the prior restraint or the pre-publication censorship. So keep your eyes open for John Bolton down the road. With all the craziness going on, it wouldn't surprise me if one day we wake up and he's under indictment or a grand jury has come back and brought and recommended charges for breaking national security standards. And perhaps the quirkiest of our censorship or potential censorship issues from the summer is that of Michael Cohen. As you know, he ended up going to jail for lying under oath and some other shenanigans that he was involved in with the president. And then once COVID-19 broke, he got himself out of jail and was posted under house arrest, what they call it in criminal justice terms. They call it home confinement. I'm not sure if the semantics really make a difference, but during his home confinement, he was eating in outdoor restaurants in Park Avenue, and was meeting with reporters and meeting with his publisher and his agent, and his home confinement sounded pretty cushy. And right around when he was getting ready to publish his book, he was pictured in the New York Post eating in a fancy restaurant in the city, and then a day or two later, he was summoned to his probation officer, and the Department of Justice was rescinding his home confinement because of allegations he had broken the terms of that home confinement. And again, the irony of the world we live in. Media organizations and a handful of First Amendment scholars coalesced and filed a brief on his behalf in federal court, arguing that his First Amendment rights were being limited by this government action. And again, this is a guy who had no love for the press because his boss didn't like the aggressive press. But here it was. Here was the press and a group of media scholars, First Amendment scholars, rushing to his defense. Bizarre world we live in. Just in a issue of disclosure, I was part of a coalition that signed on to an amicus brief, and because of that, I was able to listen in on the hearing. The federal judge in this case, Judge Hellerstein, held a hearing, and there were a couple hundred lawyers and observers and interested parties listening in. It was a phone call, speakerphone, through Zoom, and I was able to listen in on this, and this was Judge Hellerstein's finding. Right, he thought that the purpose of the rescinding the furlough was retaliatory, and that it was a violation of Mr. Cohen's First Amendment rights. And a week later, the book came out. So definitely a couple of bold statements here, right? With the courts, even today, the courts are upholding the First Amendment values and the First Amendment rights, and standing pretty firm, standing very firm on this concept of the prior restraint or the pre-publication censorship. And again, that's a pretty bold, important statement that we get to see here, even in this contemporary setting. Briefly, some of the other stuff we've been dealing with. We can start with the president marching across the street with his Bible to shut down protesters, and that came a couple of days after this executive order was published, intending to prevent online censorship. And these are these are the preface statements lauding free speech in our democracy, and then later on in the executive order, it would essentially empower the government to engage in censorship. To date, there's been a lot of controversy around this executive order. there are questions of whether this is even, whether this is constitutional under the First Amendment, which I'll reserve judgment on that because the court hasn't ruled on it yet, but there are questions about that. There are basic policy questions and constitutional questions about whether the president is even legally authorized to issue this kind of executive order, which essentially orders both the Federal Communications Commission and the Federal Trade Commission through Department of Commerce to intervene with social media platforms. So this is a constitutional law book waiting to be written right here and there, with a number of questions about government power and the authority to even engage in that sort of government action. So we'll see the true test of this one of these days when there is some actual action that results from that. Which then brings us to, where do we end up resolving all these issues? Okay, and that brings us to the Supreme Court, which is really up in the air right now. And I'm probably pulling you all away from your C-SPAN or CNN or NPR live playing of Judge Coney Barrett, the Judge Coney Barrett hearing. I was watching yesterday. I did not watch today because there's not going to be that much. There's not going to be that much suspense or the drama that we saw with the Kavanaugh hearing, or even the drama that we saw 25 plus years ago with the Thomas hearings. So, the drama and the theatrics of what's going to be going on with the Judiciary Committee are just that, drama and theatrics. End of the day, the numbers are what the numbers are. And unless there's some sort of procedural trick the Democrats can pull, or a move that they could pull that I'm not aware of, we will see Justice Coney Barrett on the bench probably fairly quickly. So that's and that's obviously Justice Ginsburg, who Judge Barrett will replace. I got to meet Justice Ginsburg twice in Washington, so I've got this wonderful picture with her. And it was about 10 years ago at an event in Washington that I'm involved with. And that's Justice Barrett. I'm gonna, and it all brings us back to voting. Before we open this up to questions, I'll leave you with a fine quote from Chief Justice Warren from a 1960s voting rights case, where he categorizes voting as a fundamental right that is at the heart of our constitutional government, that it's imperative and part of our real constitutional mandate to be active participants in our democracy. So, hopefully you guys will all get out and vote, or vote by absentee ballot, or whatever. And again, it transcends party. This isn't voting isn't a partisan issue. It really does transcend politics and party, but there it is for us. And here's my contact info. I'm available. I'm easily findable through the university, and always eager to talk to people.